Hello and welcome back to the Redfox and Flux Tavern. This is Season 2. We finally made it to Season 2. Unfortunately, Redfox, due to schedule, will no longer be hosting. In his place, we have Microslice,
Hello?
who will be taking over as our third wheel.
Frankly, we should change the name then.
No, he is now a fox.
No.
We have the technology.
Yep.
Okay, this season we'll be going over mostly the Dungeon Master's Guide, but briefly at the end we'll cover the Monster Manual, just as far as any DM needs to roughly know the Monster Manual. Key monsters that are very common in campaigns, things like that. Just get 2 books done with 1 stone. So we're going to start off with running the game and using the rules, because these are 2 things that are very key to running a game. To begin with, what a DM has to provide as a Dungeon Master is he has to provide the adventures, he has to teach the game, he has to provide the world, he has to educate the rules, and he has to keep the game moving forward. What that all means in a nutshell is it's your job to make the adventures. Don't just go in there and be like, okay, guys, what do you want to do today? That will make for a very strange and probably not too fun game. If there's new people in your group or people who don't know the game too well, it's your job to make sure that you teach them how to play while they're playing in a fun and interesting way. Don't stop every 5 minutes to be like, well, we're doing this, and then give some lecture on what you're about to do. Providing the world is a lot like providing the adventure. You have to have an idea in your head going into it. How does the world that your game takes place in work? If you don't have that set up before the first session, you're kind of going to be in trouble pretty quick, because it does not take long for players to move off the beaten path and start poking around at things and, okay, what happens if I do this? Educating the rules, quite simply, it's your job to basically say what the rules are and are not at any given moment. And obviously, to keep the game moving forward, you just have to make sure that everything's running and they're not just sitting in place arguing for 5 minutes about what to do next. Anyone else want to give any opening thoughts?
I have one technique for running games is to build out the world first, populate it, and then put instances of adventures and things, seed it with possibilities, and watch what your players do, and adapt to what they do, say, or plan.
Right, and we'll definitely get more in depth into that when we get into the actual chapter on running adventures, but that is a very viable way of doing it. You can also just go as far as just kind of figuring out who the key NPCs of your world are, what the key features of your world are, and the people, places, and things within it, and then kind of build it as you go. That's also very viable as long as you have that framework ready by the first session. The next thing a DM has to do is he has to work with his players to provide the play style of each session and of the game in general. Don't force your players to play your way, and don't let the players force you to play their way. If you go to them saying, we're going to do a dungeon crawl, and they decide halfway through the 3rd session, the hell with the dungeon crawl, we're just going to go 5 sessions of doing political intrigue. Don't be afraid to put your foot down and stop the session for a few minutes and say, okay, we agreed going into this as a dungeon crawl. A dungeon crawl is what I have made. If you want to change, you're going to have to work with me and give me time to do that change. Most players will usually say, okay, you're right, we did agree to do a dungeon crawl, let's just go back, get playing again, and just do the dungeon crawl. Other times, they may convince you that, hey, maybe it'll be more fun to change the game up, and they'll let you basically call the session early, or just kind of ad-lib your way through the rest of the session, and then give you time after that to rework the game into something more like what they want to do. Generally speaking, though, that doesn't happen. It's more that they'll be distracted for a moment, for lack of a better term, and want to do something different. And you kind of have to let them do that little something different, but don't let it sidetrack from the main focus of what you set out to do as a campaign. Likewise, don't let your goal of what you want to have the campaign be sidetrack you from understanding that sometimes players just want to have fun and derp around for a session or 2. Just let them be lost for a while and not know what they're doing. If it doesn't distract for the game and things keep moving despite their being lost, then there's nothing wrong with it. Bottom line, the DM is in charge, and it's up to you to know when you put your foot down and when not to. You learn that over time as a DM.
That's the beauty of being able to build your own adventure. It's building your own adventure. You do what you want. And while it needs to adapt to the players for the most part, being a good DM is knowing when to adapt and when to put your foot down, be God, and say, fuck that.
Some of you may be wondering, well, how can there be more than one type of game? Well, believe it or not, there are. I named 2 just now. We've named a few last season. The book is a couple examples. There's Kick in the Door, which is you kick in the dungeon door, you fight the monsters, you get the treasure, and you leave. That's usually the type you go into for a dungeon crawl. The end result of each session is, did you have fun in the fights, and did you get really good loot? And that's where the vested interest ends with your group. They don't care about the overarching stuff. Maybe they do for a while, but generally what they care about is getting their loot, killing some monsters, and having a good time doing both. Deep immersion storytelling is where you get into things like your high concept cloak and dagger settings, your political settings, your war campaigns. Certainly a war campaign can be a mix, which is another type of style, is the mix between deep immersion and kick in the door. Deep immersion is more on the storytelling. A true deep immersion storytelling game is 90% storytelling, 10% combat. Combat happens because it has to, but it is not the focus. The focus is the story. XP is usually awarded in those kind of sessions for doing things like achieving the goal of the party through role-playing or convincing someone to do something your way. You might get experience points for that, as opposed to getting experience points strictly through combat. In between is usually where most campaigns fall, somewhere in the middle of the spectrum between the two extremes. Next is to know your players. Work with the style they prefer, not against it. If you know the people that you're going to play with primarily favor one end of the spectrum over the other, tailor your game toward that spectrum. Don't be like, well, I know you guys all really want to do a dungeon crawl, but I really want to do a deep immersion game. They're usually going to riot. They're going to say, screw this and kill everybody just so that you don't have anyone left to bog them down with stories so they can go around killing monsters. If you don't believe me on that, you do not understand the lengths players will go to get their way sometimes. You have to make sure you set the table rules. Things like, what do you do if somebody's absent? Do you have them play as an NPC controlled by the DM? And if that's going to be the case, it's usually a good idea to set ahead of time with your DM. What would your character do if you're not there to run him? That way the DM can kind of keep him in character. Another way of doing it is, if it's possible, have them be off doing something else. And then when they come back, have it have some bearing on what's going on or on the party. If the ranger has to be out for a session, have them off scouting the wilds and come back with information about the area the next session. How to handle new players. If a new player comes in, you have to figure out, okay, how is he going to fit into the group? How is he going to insert himself into the campaign? Dice conventions is a very important rule if you're playing in person. It's always good to know ahead of time what to do if your dice falls on the floor. Do you still play it or do you re-roll it? What do you do if your dice knocks over another dice that was already rolled and it messes up the roll? Do you reset the table and roll again, or do you just roll with it? You also have to determine book use. What books are the players allowed to use? That's usually determined before the game starts when they're making their characters, what books they can and can't pull from. Usually the books they can and can't pull from are the books they can and can't reference throughout each session. You also have to moderate the rules discussions, because discussions on the rules will come up every now and then. Someone might think something works one way, someone will think it works another way. You got to put your foot down and decide which way it goes, or whether or not you're going to pull out the book and check the official ruling. And lastly, you got to determine what's the feeling around the table. Do people want to stick to business and play the game serious, or do you want to allow jokes and off-topic discussions to interject frequently throughout the session? These are things that you as the DM have to establish with your players. What are the rules for what you can and can't do in these situations? You got to learn to work with your players and how to handle disputes or challenges. So if they do have an argument with the rules, you have to learn how far you can and can't push them based on tempers and personalities in the room. You're the referee. More than anything, that's something you should always keep in mind as a DM. You are the referee of the game. What you say goes. If you decide that they're both wrong and you're going to do it some third way without checking the book, then you do it some third way without checking the book. If you decide one guy's right, one guy's wrong, you have to be willing to not only say that one guy's right and one guy's wrong, but just put a stop to any arguments about, oh, why did you pick him? Because those will never end. I've had games destroyed by those arguments. The last thing you really need to know about that sort of stuff is metagaming. Do you or do you not allow metagaming? Most DMs do not allow metagaming. What metagaming is, for those who do not know, is using out-of-game knowledge to influence in-game events. Just because you know the stat block of a troll by heart does not mean your character knows the stat block of a troll by heart. In fact, he has no way of ever knowing the stat block of a troll by heart, because stat blocks don't exist in-game. You have to determine how much is too much when it comes to metagaming. Do you let them have a little bit of understanding, like, well, I already know he's weak against fire, so can I just argue that my character knows this because it's common knowledge? Or do you say, no, your character does not know a troll is weak against fire? He has to figure that shit out on his own. Those are just very key things to remember as a DM. You want to have anything to interject on those points?
I got two big ones. One, you can cheat, and I advise cheating your ass off as a DM. Playing as a GM, you can cheat, and you should cheat as much as you want, because you can make a fight so much more cinematic if you cheat.
Oh yeah, many times I have just ignored the dice rolls. I let the dice rolls happen to give people an idea or a feeling that the game is running as normal, but I'm secretly just deciding in my head arbitrarily, well, you know what, he rolled a 5, but fuck it, you hit him anyway.
Worst case scenario, why you should cheat? Your bad guy has the heroes with his knife against their throats. Your guy swings, he crit fails. No, you don't do that. That immediately takes all power out of your bad guy. You make sure the bad guy will pretty much always hit. If you have a major hero, they do not mess up. Make sure that the dice does not affect you. You decide all the outcomes before you roll, usually.
But that's not the it. Sometimes it's funny to just let the dice fall as they lie.
Oh no, it's hilarious, but don't do it too often.
Don't do it too often. Do it for the lulz once in a great while, because it can make for some great after game just laughs. And even in universe stuff, it can be funny where you guys go back and they're like, well, how was this big guy we've all been fearing for months and years in our town? Well, he stabbed himself in the face by accident. We didn't actually kill him, but he'll take that reward anyway.
Any self-respecting adventurer wouldn't admit that, but...
He would if he's a paladin, because as we've established, paladins cannot lie. He can either stay silent or tell the truth.
And never ever let your players know you cheated.
Yes, that is important. Make it look like it happened because that's the way it was supposed to happen. Don't let them know that you fudged the results greatly, especially if you fudge them a lot. My rule of thumb for big fudges that the players will get angry about if they found out is don't go too far too often. It's okay to go too far every now and then with fudging things, but don't do it often. Usually players, if they find out that 16 would have been a miss because it's a 17, but you said it hit anyway, usually stuff like that they'll let slide because you did it for the sake of keeping things moving. But if you just decided that you secretly rolled a 1 on the villain, and he should by all rights have completely fucked up what he's doing, but you decide he gets a crit anyway, just so that the idea of your story in your head, like that he has to wipe the party and knock them all unconscious, and you decide to roll it, because that's just how he has a spell that will accomplish this for him. You just decide that that spell works perfectly, even though it completely botched. Because they didn't see your dice, generally speaking, they won't know any better. They'll think, oh my god, this guy's awesome and he got a good roll, or he's got great stats. But in reality, you just said it happened. If you want to avoid challenges, another good thing to do if you're going to cheat is not stat the NPC. If you stat it, they'll try and kill it if they know you're cheating, because they'll just get angry at that NPC and try and just break through your DM bullshit because they know you won't do it too often. But if you don't stat him, and they know he's not statted, then they are forewarned. You can do whatever the fuck you want if they get into a combat with that guy.
That's a big saying in D&D. If you stat it, they will kill it. When Wizards statted some of the gods, people went on a fucking vendetta trying to kill those things.
3.5 does something that I disagree that's similar to that. They statted the demon princes. And 3.5, all of the lords of the Nine Hells are statted, as well as the major demon princes of the Abyss. Because they're statted, people try to kill them. But they shouldn't. It's like statting the Tarisk, in my opinion. You should not have statted the Tarisk, because there were some pretty hilariously cheesy ways the player can cheese kill the Tarisk if he's your end boss of your campaign. For those who don't know, the Tarisk is a giant beast that awakens from the center of the earth every so many years. Sometimes it's millennia, sometimes it's centuries, sometimes it's even longer than that. Sometimes it's millions of years. The point being, he's supposed to be unbeatable as long as he's in contact with the earth. This has led people to realize that he has a stat. He has a weight stat, he has a strength stat, he has a grapple stat. By logic of the rules, in some versions of the Tarisk's weakness, he has to be in physical contact with the earth. People have grappled him out of the air and then killed him. Because as long as he's suspended up by your super strong idiot, he should not be able to do this guy who's about to caber toss him, then he can be killed as long as he's in midair. That's something you shouldn't do. I don't believe in statting the Tarisk. If the Tarisk shows up, you have to use some sort of a fancy MacGuffin to kill him, as it should be. And those are things as the DM you can decide to do. You can decide to put the Tarisk or a Demon Prince in your game and decide, you know what? He has no stats. And this is where metagaming comes in. The players know out of game that these things have stats if they've read the books that they're in. But their characters don't. Make it clear to them that you're not following the book, then they're just as scared as their characters are when these monsters show up and they know that there's no stats of this giant endgame boss. That means they have to kill it besides combat.
Character customization is not the sole purview of characters. DM has a unique ability and responsibility to make a game interesting by fudging things, making it more interesting and out of the norm. That's what makes a great campaign.
I had a second thing to say for DM. I don't believe this gets referenced anywhere in the book. You are not fighting the players. Unless, in a very few types of game sessions, is it you versus the player. Do not get antagonistic towards the player. It doesn't result in a good game for anyone. You are there to create the game, not win it.
I think it does mention that in more of the storytelling parts of the Dungeon Master's Manual, that you're there to tell a story, not to fight the players. But it's more inferred. I don't think it's explicitly stated yet. Don't fight the party. Throw monsters at the party. Throw obstacles at the party. But put them there because it's something for them to overcome.
If the player loses, you also lose because you made a bad game. Unless it's something like the Tomb of Horrors. Then it is you versus the character. But very rarely is it that kind of game.
Other dungeon crawls usually are you against the player if they're a very basic dungeon crawl where they're just going through this infinitely downward going dungeon that just keeps going into more and more insane territories of, oh my god, what the fuck is coming out of those walls? Then usually it's very similar because you're running a sort of Tomb of Horrors-esque thing where the whole point is to see how long they can survive against the monsters and traps you've set before them.
One thing I've heard again and again is give the players enough rope to hang themselves.
Yeah, if the players die, it should be their own fault and not the fault of the DM. I'm going to use an example here. I botched a jump and fell into a thing with an ooze. I eventually died because someone threw a giant keg of fucking gunpowder into the pit with me and the fucking ooze and detonated it. Sure, the explosion killed the ooze, but the explosion killed me. That's not the fault of the DM. The DM allowed it because it's player stupidity, but I could not begrudge the DM for what that player did to me. Because of the nature of the group, you can allow that in some groups because a good-natured, friendly group who are all great friends with each other will just be like, oh my god, dude, you're such an idiot. And you'll magically revive your character somewhere down the road or make a new character and move on. Other times, you shouldn't do that because some groups, especially groups that are very new with each other, don't necessarily have that same sort of good-natured, oh my god, you dick attitude to just having a keg of dynamite thrown on their head and exploded. This is where knowing your party comes in, which is another good point. Know your group before you start the game. Know what their tendencies are, how well they know each other, and that gives you a good idea of what you can and can't allow for both DM bullshit and player bullshit. But for the most part, you should avoid purposely allowing anything to happen that just outright kills somebody. Unless you warn them ahead of time to make multiple characters. Because then they know it's going to be one of those kind of sessions where it's going to be a grind of character dying after character dying.
Meat grinder campaigns can be fun.
Oh, they can be. They're also a little difficult to write sometimes unless they are just a straight dungeon crawl because you have to justify all these new people coming in and out of the group constantly. You also have to set the stage, which is a very important thing. That's right up there with messing around with the rules in importance, and that you have to be able to recap the sessions very clearly, and you have to be able to rule on the mapping. How much do you tell the players if one of the players is making their own map? Just because the rules say they can see so far doesn't mean you necessarily want them to see so far. The easiest way to avoid that is just put something very thick, like thick brush or a cave wall or something that blocks their vision so that they can't see everything. Or just come up with some other plausible in-game explanation for why they can't see everything. And you also have to have a map on the table, and you have to figure out exactly what can they and can they not see on the table map, and how do you represent that. It's easier to do on online programs like Roll-D20 and Map Tools, because they have tools in place within the programs to allow for line of sight and vision range. The easiest way I've found with a tabletop is there's essentially rollable whiteboards you can buy that have a grid already on them, and you just draw on the grid with essentially a whiteboard marker, and you can wipe it off after every session. That lets you use a master map, usually on grid paper. Grid paper is a great thing to use if you're making maps, and you can just draw from the grid paper onto the actual whiteboard material as your people explore based on what they can and can't see. That does require a degree of money and available supplies that not everyone might have, but if you can get a hold of it and you have the money and available stores that sell them, certainly that's a good way to go. Miniatures, if you can afford them, are great. If you can't afford miniatures, you can just use different coins and just mark on the coin with a little mark, especially if you're using coins that no one really gives a shit about. Put a little tick mark to show which way their face is. Even use like little army men. I did a D20 modern session once, just like a one-shot where we used little green army men as the character models. Don't be afraid to just take breaks every now and then during the session. Taking a 5, 10, even 20, 30-minute break can be very needed sometimes, especially if there's been a lot of hectic stuff going on. There's a natural pause, just be like, okay, who wants to take a break for a few minutes, get some water, get some snacks. That's pretty much the basics for running the game that you really need to know.
I got something. Be impartial. Do not favor one character. If you do, they're the biggest dick of a TM. It gets really annoying if one character gets favored.
I had forgotten about that because I've only had one game where that happened. My DM did a thing where everyone had one special ability that they were allowed to get that was partly set up by the DM and partly set up by the player based on their class. It was a 4E game. It was basically a one session per use power that completely ignored game rules and allowed you to do something just completely awesome and badass. Like my character is a warlord, and my basic thing was I could just be really fucking inspiring once per session. No roles needed. I just had to describe how I was being inspiring. And I could convince pretty much any number of people to do anything I wanted. Another guy's power, because he was a warlock with the Infernal Pact, he just had a demon portal in him. The DM loved the demon portal. He began writing entire sessions around the demon portal. He began to design the entire campaign around the demon portal. And the rest of us were set there, okay, our powers are neat and all, but it's essentially become us escorting him the game. You don't want to do that. You don't want to feel like the secondary party members in a JRPG, while one guy in the session is the fucking hero character where if you die, it's game over. So you want to avoid that. Let everyone shine equally, unless they don't want to shine, in which case, there's not much you can do there. That's their own damn fault if they don't want to shine.
Do not favor your girlfriend if it ever happens that you have to DM a game with significant others. That happened once, but that was a very inexperienced DM, and I don't think he realized he was doing it too badly.
I have a story about that, actually. One of my DMs had his boyfriend in the session, It was a game that I got to run for a change. I'd already met him because in the previous game he'd run, the boyfriend had played in. And I was like, okay, cool, whatever. You can play in our game. The minute I ruled against him, he made a ready action. This was my first ever time running the Naruto RPG. He ruled that I make a ready action to defend myself if something happens. Well, it was a sneak attack round. Ready actions do not supersede the sneak attack round, in my opinion. If they sneak attack, they sneak attack. If you just could not perceive the threat, you cannot react to the threat. So he got hit, he took 4 damage. He called bullshit so loud, he ran crying to his partner, as the person he knows is the one who usually DMs our group, to supersede me on my own ruling in my own game. And I was just like, no. That's the thing to watch out for. Avoid situations where stuff like that can happen. Don't just avoid letting people who are involved with each other play in the same game as each other. But don't be surprised if one goes crying to the other, if they're an inexperienced player, and the other one's an experienced player, to try and get their back. As a DM, you kind of have to know how to diffuse that if you're playing in a group where that dynamic is present. It's part of knowing your players. Bear that in mind, there are many different player dynamics, and that could be one of them. It's your job to determine the outcome of dice rolls, which is pretty basic. Also, know how to end a session. Don't end the session in the middle of combat. I've had DMs where they've done that, and my God, it gets annoying if you cannot get everyone together because of rotating schedules for several weeks at a time, and you come back, it's the middle of combat, and you're all sitting there going, who the fuck's turn was it? Or what the hell was going on? Why are we even fighting? These are things you want to avoid. Always end on either natural breaks or cliffhangers. Most cliffhangers will provide their own natural breaks that you can use. But if you can remember, someone just told a very important piece of information. Everyone was flabbergasted and had nothing to say for like a solid minute. We'd been playing for 3 hours, so I said, fuck it, we're just going to stop there. You can think of your responses before we come back. That's a good way to end it, because it leaves them with this revelation that somebody left them, and they could think about that for the week or however long it is till the next session. And then you can come back, and it's usually something they'll remember as that's where we left off. Natural breaks are very commonly things like you've just finished an adventure and you haven't quite started another one yet. Those are all good places to end sessions. So now we're in using the rules. I want to just briefly cover the very first thing in using the rules because it is important. You have more movement rules than the players do. Specifically, you have 3 or 4 different movement rules. You have rules for evasion and pursuit. You might be wondering, well, when will I use that? More often than you think, because you'll be surprised how often the players just want to chase somebody. You have to know how to make rules for chasing somebody. You also have to think about 3 dimensions. The players don't. Most players do not fly around. A lot of monsters do fly around. So you have to think in your head, how do I take this 2-dimensional grid and convert it in my mind into a 3-dimensional grid? You got to be prepared to do that if you want to put anything that involves flying or levitation. You have to know the standard scale. On most maps, a 1-inch square is a 5-foot area, and a 30-millimeter figure is a human-sized creature. You got to keep in mind how movement actually works, because it's going to be your job to tell people when they're moving too far. Trust me, players will attempt to move too far every now and then just to kind of get a little bit closer to that guy. Hope the DM doesn't notice. You have to be on top of that kind of stuff. Another thing is to think about that players don't think about because they don't really know those rules for it. There are rules for moving around within a square because a square is a 5-foot area. You could do a lot in a 5-foot area. As a DM, you have to be prepared to say what they can and cannot do within their own square. You also have to keep in mind that there are various bonus types. There's alchemical bonuses, armor bonuses, circumstance, competence, and you have to keep in your head what falls under what bonuses and which bonuses do and do not stack, because players will constantly try and stack things, especially players like Flux who want to break the fuck out of characters. And as a DM, you have to know which ones do and don't stack, so you can sit there and say, no, that doesn't work. You do not get plus 20 to your roll, because those do not stack with each other. You only get plus 5.
Temp HP does not stack.
No, it does not.
The rule to remember about bonuses is that bonuses with the same name do not stack. Unless in the description of a spell or magical effect or whatever, it says specifically that this stacks with this specific thing or whatever. If a spell does not have a type, it's just a straight out bonus, which is very unusual, it stacks with everything. There's ways to get around this, but sometimes they're expensive, sometimes they're less expensive.
Yeah, usually the easiest way to stack things is remember that a shield bonus is different than an armor bonus. If you don't wear a shield, this is usually the case if you're a magic user, and you have a spell that applies a very high shield bonus, you are allowed to stack that with armor. Likewise, if you do have a shield and you don't have armor, and you can give it a higher armor bonus, stack it. Natural armor and armor also stack. If you naturally have a tough scaly hide and you wear armor, then your tough scaly hide's toughness and that armor's toughness stack. Realistically, if you cut through armor and there's a big-ass dragon scale hide underneath that armor, then yes, that dragon scale hide is going to deflect your weapon that's been weakened by the impact of it going through the armor. So you have to overcome both armors to get through to the person. Now, these are cheap ways you can stack things, mostly armor. Armor is the cheapest and easiest thing to stack, in my opinion. Armor and shields. Just don't wear 2 shields, because that will not stack. Having 2 tower shields does not make you any more or less concealed, or any more or less protected.
I have a specific story about this. It's about item creation, which is a whole can of worms that we can get into later, but essentially it was an amulet of the shield spell. It was constantly on, and my mage would wear it, and it cost significantly less than a amulet of shielding, which had the same effect but a different bonus. My amulet cost about half and still gave a shield bonus instead of a different kind of bonus, and it was much cheaper.
When we get into magic items, we'll be able to illustrate a lot more examples of that, but there are cases where magic items, for whatever bizarre reason, Wizards of the Coast decided a cheaper item will in fact give an identical but better bonus as a more expensive item, for seemingly no reason. The items will not stack with each other, so it's not like you have to make one more expensive so that you can't just buy both at the same time. It's just some weird oversight or decision on their part to make one more expensive than the other, but worse. Another thing you can do to exploit things is if you have low-level magic powers as a mage that you want to be able to emulate without having to waste spell components, ask your DM, and we'll be able to get to this in the magic items as well, to let you buy minor wondrous items. Many minor wondrous items can emulate the effect of low-level spells. Even if you're not a wizard, you can do this too. I had a fighter who had Hand of the Mage around his neck, and he was the greatest thing for checking for traps ever, because his strategy for traps was, first I poke it with a 10-foot pole, and then I stand at the max range of Mage Hand, and then cast Mage Hand on the door with my Infinite Use Necklace. Mage Hand can manipulate any object less than 5 pounds. A doorknob is less than 5 pounds. Therefore, he can manipulate doorknobs.
Another great thing to do would be to consider used items, like wands, that do not have a full set of charges. That could cut down costs of great usable item like a wand of Cure Light Wounds and still be affordable, instead of having to buy an entirely new one, which can be quite expensive.
And those are things you get to decide as part of deciding the rules. There is no rule for what happens if you buy a limited use item with some of its uses already used up. Rules for this do not exist. So as a DM, you have to invent the rules. That's something you do very often. And that's near the end of the using the rules chapter. What do you do if they want to do something that isn't actually referenced in the rules? Well, you have to make a rule. Usually you have to stick to this rule once you've made it, because they're going to try and repeat the action, and you're going to have to reference back what you did, so always write down when you make a ruling. Other times you don't have to worry about it, because it's usually something very specific and one-offy. Like if you're fighting somebody in a cave and you decide to make a stalagmite fall for the ceiling to kill the giant fucking cyclops thing you're fighting. Generally speaking, that is not a situation that's going to be repeated. That's a one-shot desperation thing where you bring that thing down on its head because you can't kill it on your own. So you generally only have to roll for what the damage, what the rolls, and everything else are for that once. But if they want to know what the roll is for running up a wall, grabbing a chandelier, and fighting it into the sky, you're probably going to have to be asked to do that multiple times. Because once they can do a fucking swashbuckling move like that once, they're going to want to do it again and again and again.
Oh, I had a friend who was a monk, and he flying kicked a gate open, and he just started falling in love with that flying kick. Wasn't the best sometimes when our DM put a trap on the door.
Yeah. Monks, and to a lesser extent, rogues and bards, who are all very athletic people with high tumble and acrobatic skills, usually do wacky stuff like that a lot. Duelists more so, because there's kind of this mindset if you're playing a duelist where the duelist is built to be the swashbuckling, haha, roguish person. And you kind of want to play that way. You want to do the things where you grab the rope to the chandelier, cut it right into the sky, jump off onto the balcony, and escape unharmed. And the DM has to rule that stuff. As I said before in my earlier story about the player who had an issue with the ready action, you have to rule heavily on what isn't a ready action, and what doesn't constitute an activation of your ready action. Because ready action is a very vaguely worded rule, and it leaves a lot to DM and player interpretation. And as a DM, you have to kind of set the ground rules for ready actions whenever it comes up. And why do I say that? Because I want to start briefly about how you start an encounter.
One thing to add, so I don't forget, because I'm not going to remember this after this episode, that used item thing, it's a great way to add value to treasures that you're trying to fill out. You want to give them something good, but not something too good. So that wand of fireball, they think it might have full charges. They think they've gotten something great, but it's only got like 3 or 4 charges. Yes, it's really powerful, but it would be expensive to recharge, and it doesn't have that many charges, so it's a valuable commodity that they will see that they can use that later, but they need to save it.
Yeah, and since the loot table is going to be part of the ending of this discussion, I just want to briefly say that looking on the loot table and deciding what loot to give your players, that's something you definitely want to keep in mind is what loot do you want to give them? Do you want to give them something they can use like that? You can. I would always make sure that when they identify a magic item, if it has multiple uses, let them know how many uses of it they have. Identifying magical loot is something that the players, they rely on whatever it is you told them. If you give them incorrect information and they waste their magic item, that's your fault, not theirs.
Sometimes. There are rules for adjudicating this, and there are parts of it where if you do poorly enough in the identify, you either get incorrect information or incomplete information.
Right. Usually a player has an idea of what case will be because they're going to see their own roll. If they see they rolled low, they can pretty much assume that whatever you told them is either incorrect or it's missing key information. If they get a high roll, they can usually assume to trust whatever it is you told them. But don't be afraid to give them more than just fluff. Give them the rules. Tell them what page the item's on. Let them look at the description of the item. If they know how many charges there are, let them know exactly how many charges there are. A wizard can usually feel if the magic has been lessened or diminished. If they roll too low, to tell them exactly how many charges a wand has, but you want to give them the wand anyway and they rolled just high enough that you feel like they should know that it's been expended, let them know that it feels like the magic of this wand has been diminished somehow, like it might not last as long as it should. That doesn't tell them how many uses it has left, but it does tell them it's been used. And we can get more on that in a minute. I just want to briefly say, one of the things you want to keep an eye on when starting an encounter is everybody wants to go first, which is why initiative exists, to make sure that nobody can go first. Surprise rounds, though, do not abuse surprise rounds against your party.
Oh yeah, that's being a douche.
If every room they open is, it looks safe, you go in, surprise, they're in the ceiling, or surprise, they're inside metal boxes. That's no bush, that's a giant fucking cave troll. Things like that get old very fast. So don't try to surprise your players too often. Sometimes they will get surprised out of just their own stupidity not checking well enough. But other times they check as well as they possibly could and you still don't let them see it because you want them to be in ambush, but don't do it too often. Likewise, let them get surprise rounds on enemies, but don't let them always get the surprise round on the enemy. Because sometimes you just want to start an even footing or you just want the enemy to surprise them. There's no real guidelines to follow for that, in my opinion. There's no guideline for how to start an encounter. Generally speaking, if a fight's going to happen, you already have an idea in your head why and how the fight's going to start. That's your own personal preference there, but just bear in mind, don't abuse surprise rounds one way or the other.
There are many ways to adjudicate how an encounter starts. You just have to decide first how it starts, and then you can go from there. This party is unaware, no. This party is unaware, no. Only parts of specific parties are aware, and they act during the start, and then the rest of the group on both sides begins. Things like that. And there are rules to adjudicate this, you just need to decide how it starts first.
And another thing to keep in mind is everything is happening simultaneously in a given round. Every round that everyone takes their turns, everything they're doing is happening at the same time. A way I like to do it sometimes is I like to let everyone do their rolls in order, and then I determine what happens. I just kind of write down, he hit, he hit, he hit, he missed, he failed miserably, he critted. And then I run down the list in order and say, okay, this is the order of the events that took place in this however many second interval that the given round. And so in those seconds, this is what happened. That makes the fight seem more interesting, especially if you're doing a very dramatic, cinematic fight. It takes a little longer to get the turn to go through because everyone's doing their stuff first, then you're describing it. Other times it makes it faster, especially early game, but late game it makes it take forever. Late game fights are a pain. Late game I try and put more things on MacGuffins and story than on combat just to avoid it. And that's just one way to do it. You can also do it just the way most people do it. I take my turn, this is what I do, okay, I describe what you just did, and then we move on. Both are viable. A combination of both makes for a nice, varied feel to combat, and those are just some things to keep in mind. Something else you can do is if a fight's going too quickly, don't be afraid to send in reinforcements on the enemy side. Send in a couple mooks that you know the party can easily take care of that aren't nearly as powerful as what they're fighting. Or if they are fighting mooks, send in quite a few more of them if they're killing them faster than you thought to try and make the fight take as long as you expected. If you expected 10 minutes of a particular session to be dedicated to a particular fight, and that fight's only taking 3 minutes, you don't have 7 minutes of material to fill the gap with, add in 7 minutes worth of reinforcements so that the fight feels big and epic and fun, like the 10-minute fight was supposed to, instead of letting it be over real fast. The player be like, well, that was it. We did that in 2 seconds. So don't be afraid to do that, but also don't send in reinforcements too often. Just like with surprise rounds, it's great when it's sprinkled about as a spice to a campaign, but not when it's every fight is like, oh my god, the fighting starts, here comes the reinforcements. Because then they'll start sneaking everywhere. Sneaking will take forever, and it's not fun. I was in a game where we had to sneak everywhere because there were traps everywhere, and it takes forever if you're constantly checking for traps on every goddamn square. And obviously, rules for damage fall into what we discussed earlier about the DM can cheat. You're just as responsible as your mage for keeping a track of area of effect. And let's get to the loot table then, because the only thing left is skill and ability checks, and those are pretty straightforward. Again, you can cheat on skill and ability checks. If you decide that you really want them to not fail and fall off a 100-foot cliff, you can fudge the number and say, okay, well, you can make a save to try and avoid actually falling and do a reflex save. I know you failed your climb check. You could do little things like that to try and keep the party from accidentally killing itself at skill checks.
It is in everyone's interest to avoid a party wipe, even the DM, most of the time.
Right, because a party wipe requires essentially a reset of the entire campaign. Unless the new party has a plausible explanation to be just as invested in the events of what was going on that led to the death of the original party, as the original party did, then generally speaking, that just starts a new game. So avoid party wipe.
Yeah, that's a whole lot of work for everyone that didn't need to be done.
The only real important thing as far as skills and abilities go, as a DM, that you are definitely responsible for is the rules on having characters on watch. Because characters will always ask to be on watch, but there's no rules for that really in the player's handbook. That's something the DM has to take care of. When do you put in an ambush in the middle of the night? When do you not put an ambush in the middle of the night? Who can and can't tech it? These are things you got to keep aware of. Onto loot. The first part of loot is always XP, because that's the thing people want more than anything else, is to level up and get their fancy new abilities. There's multiple ways to award XP and to handle level up in general. You could use XP, in which case you can go by the book. By the book means that every fight has an encounter level, every encounter level has a set payout of XP once it's been completed. There's various ways of doing it. Like if you're in a not so combat heavy campaign, there are rules for awarding XP based on character actions. And there's my favorite way of doing leveling up, which is to say screw XP. XP is a minutiae thing that nobody wants to keep track of, and it's very annoying. If you have a story in mind and your campaign is story oriented, you can ignore XP and instead do what I like to call the level as needed system. The level as needed system works on the grounds that you've gone a couple sessions, things are escalating, the players are beginning to struggle a little. Let them level up. Just give them a level. In 4E, this is incredibly simple to do because nothing costs experience points at 4E. In 3.5, in some of the older settings, things do cost experience points. The way I rule when I do that system when it comes to experience points that they have a pool to spend is always assume that your experience point total when I level you up by story is equal to the halfway point between the minimum to be your current level and the amount needed to level up. That usually gives you a decent sized pool, is small enough that you won't exploit but big enough that you can use to spend on spells and other things that cost XP. As far as loot goes, there is a random table you can use for loot. It'll make some wacky stuff happen, like wolves that just randomly have priceless works of art for no reason whatsoever. I have no idea where they're keeping it or how they're carrying it, but random wolves in the woods have the frickin' Mona Lisa or something. Or you could just decide in your head, how much money does my party need? Well, they need so much gold because they're at such a level to buy adequate gear. Just decide that when they complete the big adventure, that there's a reward or a treasure room adequate enough to pay for their expenses for that adventure and to prepare them for the next adventure. That's one way of doing it. That's very similar to the level up as needed rule. Otherwise, if you use the loot table, there's all these fancy numbers and figures in the book that we don't really need to get into in too much detail that you can use to determine how much gold they get, whether or not they get any non-gold wealth items such as gems, paintings, other works of art, treasures, items. You can follow that table. It's very easy, or you can just dole things out as needed. If you know one character is struggling, don't be afraid to just throw a magic item for them into it. Something that'll bring them up from struggling to, okay, I'm on par with the rest of the group now. And then when people start complaining, just start doling out magic items to them in turn. You can sometimes just give everybody a magic item, especially if everyone's kind of even. You generally don't want to give one guy a magic item, then nobody else a magic item. Or if you do give one guy a magic item, you want to very quickly get the other one's magic items. So there's many different ways to handle loot, but as a DM, it's your job to figure out what you want to do for loot management and how you dole it out. But remember above all that you don't want one player to feel like he has more loot than the other, or any players that feel like they don't have enough loot. That's a thin line to walk because sometimes they feel like they don't have enough loot, but they have exactly the loot they need and they're good to go, and to give them any more will break the game. Which is, again, as a Junticator, you being the boss, that's where you have to learn where do you put your foot down. Any more thoughts from anybody?
A challenge rating of 1 is a good match for a first level party of 4. Goblin is 1/6 or 1/4 of a challenge rating. And it talked about XP rewards and how character parties shouldn't be fighting anything 8 or more levels above or below them. That's part of learning how to balance a fight so that it's not too challenging, but it's not too weak either.
The sweet spot usually for your average encounter is a 1-for-1 ratio. If you're level 4, you throw challenge rating 4. If you're level 5, you throw challenge rating 5, etc., etc. And then for your mini bosses, you bump it up a level. If they're 5, you throw a level 6. If they're 7, you throw a level 8. For the end of adventure kind of a boss, go up another level. Throw a level 10 at a level 8. Throw a level 12 at a level 10. That's not always wise to do, especially when you start getting to the higher levels, because monsters become increasingly more bullshit. especially in 3.5. I cannot even begin to describe, even when we do an episode dedicated just to monsters, just how bullshit some monsters can get in just a few minutes. Always bear in mind what type of monster they're fighting and what it can do, because some monsters will just wipe the party even if it seems fair. Just because it says they're challenge rating 5 and the party's level 5 doesn't mean it doesn't have the ability to just completely eat the party in one turn. Some monsters can do that. Worms in general, especially purple worms. Purple worms have a challenge rating. They're usually reserved for bosses, though, because they have the ability to just eat things they run into. They'll just automatically bite you, and if they bite you, they automatically put you in the mouth and try to swallow you. And if they swallow you, you're pretty much dead.
There's rules for swallowing and getting out of that. Adventures usually have pointy things, and pointy things do a good job at cutting. I've had many characters cut themselves out of enemies.
In most cases with a purple worm, though, the damage between its bite and the swallow itself will wipe a character if they both hit in consecutive turns.
But attacking from the inside does a lot of damage, and you can't miss.
True. If you survive to get to the inside, by all means attack from the inside, but don't be surprised if getting there is harder than it sounds.
Oh yeah, it hurts. It hurts a lot.
Especially with oozes. That's an ooze's whole thing, because ooze is an ooze. It's basically a giant jello that tries to eat you. Inside that giant jello that tries to eat you is basically pure concentrated stomach acid. So once you're in that thing, you take damage every turn because you're swimming in a giant pool of stomach acid that's suspended in a jello. And it's really hard to fight from inside that jello. So usually if you're swallowed, the best thing that will save you is your party. If you see a teammate get swallowed, you better bum rush to get them out of there. Depending on the enemy in question, it may be harder for them to fight out from within than it is for you to break them out.
There are also certain creatures that you want to stay away from just because it can really piss off your party if you throw something at them, like, say, rust monsters that like to eat the magical items of the party.
Never use rust monsters. That is my rule of thumb. Any DM who uses rust monsters is instantly in danger of being blacklisted as a DM in the future for me.
Oh yeah. Unless they do something to protect the items or give them a chance to not engage.
That's also where DM cheating can come in. If the DM cheats and says that if it rolls, it never destroys anything important, it only destroys minor things to make them think they're in a sense of danger, you can do that, but that's usually kind of trick you pull out once, because once you do that with 2 rust monster fights, the party gets very suspicious.
Or they could say that the rust monster did significant damage, but the core of the magic or whatever hasn't been destroyed, so it could be repaired, or something like that.
Again, that's a very one-trick pony thing that you can do where once you've done that, they know the trick, and it's not going to be nearly as fun or threatening or interesting as the first thing, because the first time they thought the danger of losing their magic items was there. They thought the danger of their only weapon being destroyed was there, and they believed it was probably just pure luck that it didn't happen.
And by all accounts, it was.
Unless anyone has any closing thoughts or any additional insights, I believe that's about it for our flagship episode with Microslice.
Hi.
Any thoughts from you, Flux? You've been very quiet this episode.
Nah, I'm usually quiet, but I will chime in on the rust monster thing. You can use rust monsters in comedic ways because they're non-lethal, and frankly, it's very funny to make them just a giant dog that wants to eat your equipment.
I have actually been tempted to put a pet rust monster into an NPC's little following of followers. Some eccentric king who just has a domesticated rust monster who's constantly running up to the party and like, I want to eat it, I want to eat it. And he's, no, bad Fluffy, don't eat their magic things.
They're up there with these big horrible monsters, but they're really derp and can't do much other than harm your equipment.
Oh yeah, they look like a giant bug.
The best part is, I want to say, I could be wrong because I haven't read that section of D20 Modern so long. I think D20 Modern implanted them because a lot of monsters got implanted into D20 Modern by default, and there's others you can import through. I think D20 Modern has rust monsters, which is hilarious to me because what are they going to do? I guess they could eat your gun, but if you have rust monsters in your setting, you're probably running with the FX rules, which, for those who don't know, D20 Modern means those are the rules that allow things like psionics and magic. And magic users in D20 Modern, and in D&D in general, don't usually have a lot of metal on them. And a lot of characters in D20 Modern don't rely on guns, because guns are kind of expensive to maintain, because you have to keep buying bullets for them. So a rust monster in that kind of a setting seems weird to me, where everything's been replaced with plastics. Could you imagine a rust monster being like, ooh, he has a gun. Guns are metal, right? And he's got a Glock. Because Glocks are plastic. And he's like, why can't I eat your gun? What have you done to me? I cannot eat metal anymore.
Lead poisoning.
Lead poisoning has taken away your metal eating powers. You'll find other monsters like that. I think we'll have to make a list of some of those, Flux, for when we get to the final episode where we actually cover the monster manual of just seemingly dangerous but actually quite harmless monsters. And likewise, harmless CV monsters that are terrifying, because there are some of those as well. I hope everyone enjoyed this first episode on the Dungeon Master's Guide. We'll continue more of it coming episodes. I've got roughly 8 episodes, I think, planned on just the Dungeon Master's Guide before we even get to the Monster Manual. So we might even be able to do 2 episodes in the Monster Manual. depending on how we feel after doing one episode in the monster manual, 'cause not a lot to talk about unless you get into specific monsters. So I hope everyone enjoyed. Once again, this has been Sovik, Flux, and Microslice. You can see me live various times at my Twitch page, twitch.tv/SovikOnivers. Flux at twitch.tv/Flux, and I believe it is. It's been so long since I've been to Flux's stream. There's also my Patreon, patreon.com/SovikOnivers if you want to support the podcast. Marco, do you have any websites you want to plug or anything?
Well, I do have a Twitch, which I don't use very much right now. I've done a bit of experimental streaming. It's Microslice, Micsolice, on Twitch. I'm on Twitter too. That's about it. I don't usually use social networks that much.
I use Twitter a lot. You can find a link on both my Twitch and my Patreon to my Twitter, which is just at SilverConiverse on Twitter. Flux is at Flux_V2 at Twitter. And Micro at Microslice, I say.
Yeah, same spelling.
It's the same as his Twitch. So you can follow us on Twitter. At least I'm always tweeting weird stuff. Flux is weirdly musing on Kingdom Hearts a lot because he's been playing through them again. I hope everyone enjoy it. Feel free to follow us or support the Patreon or anything else. And we'll see you all next time. Starting at the beginning of the year, as my wife, who's been in the background of this podcast listening, reminded me, I have changed my Patreon goals for those who have been longtime supporters or listeners. Check those out, one of which is to get a capture card so my wife can start streaming and provide even more content for people that will also be supported by the Patreon. So if you want to see more gaming content from me, not necessarily the podcast, you can support Twitch for that as well. I hope you all enjoyed. Goodbye, and I need to find the stop recording button. Stop recording button, where are you? There you are. Goodbye, everybody.